She was left for dead in a desert ravine, bruised, broken, and forgotten. Until a silent Apache billionaire rode by on a black horse. And everything changed. The sun didn't rise that morning. It exploded. It poured molten gold across the high desert like a punishment, searing everything in its path. And somewhere in that cruel heat, down at the bottom of a forgotten ravine, lay the broken body of a girl no one expected to live, much less be found. Her dress was shredded, her hair caked with mud and blood, and her limbs twisted like brittle branches. She wasn't breathing at first glance, not really. Just the faintest flutter beneath her ribs, as if her soul hadn't quite decided whether. It was staying, buzzards circled high overhead, lazy and certain. They'd seen enough death to know when it was safe to feast. But what they hadn't seen, what no one had, was the figure who approached from the ridge, mounted on a black stallion that looked carved from the shadows themselves. He rode alone, wordless, the long coat on his shoulders flapping like wings. Behind him, he dismounted without urgency, crouched at her side, and pressed two fingers against the girl's throat. Then, as if prompted by the heartbeat only he could feel, he removed his coat and draped it over her body. Nathaniel Dakota wasn't a man people spoke about casually. He was half Apache, half legend raised on land that had been stolen and rebuilt from nothing with grit, gold, and a mind sharper than any blade. While others scrambled for oil and cattle, Nathaniel dealt in forgotten patents, rail stock, and precious metals buried deep beneath ancestral grounds. He had more wealth than the entire state bank, yet kept no address, no phone, no indulgences. People said he spoke to ghosts more than men, but on that morning, he said nothing to anyone, not even the girl he'd just saved. He hoisted her into his arms like she was a fallen child of the land and turned his horse back toward the cliffs not far behind the ridge. The little town of Black Hollow stirred awake, unaware that something had been torn from the desert that wasn't ready to die. A miner named Felix Dobbs noticed the dust cloud rising in the distance and muttered something about the storm. A waitress sweeping up glass at the diner paused when she saw the black horse pass just at the edge of her vision, but said nothing. Nathaniel passed like smoke, like thunderclouds before lightning. He didn't stop until he reached Echo Rock, a sandstone bluff wrapped around a homestead older than any Western map. There, behind iron gates and stone fences, Nathaniel laid the girl down inside a cool adobe room, where the walls hummed with ancestral memory and dried herbs hung like blessings. A woman named Delora, once a healer and midwife, now his most trusted housekeeper, began tending to the girl's wounds. It wasn't the first time she'd cared for a soul the world had tried to erase. The girl remained unconscious for 3 days, her skin peeled from sunburn, her lips cracked in the dry air. When she finally opened her eyes, she didn't scream or cry. She just stared at the ceiling as if trying to remember what had brought her back. She didn't speak, not that day, not the next. But her silence wasn't empty. It was waiting, listening. Nathaniel didn't ask her questions. He didn't press her for answers. He simply had her moved to a room with tall windows and thick curtains where she could feel the desert wind without it cutting her. He ordered fresh water to be brought in hourly. Food sat and touched on trays, but she began drinking. Eventually, sip by sip, as if testing whether this world could be trusted again, the bruises told their own story. Finger marks on her wrists, rope burns along her ankles, a deep gash behind her shoulder blade, likely from a whip. She hadn't fallen into that ravine. She'd been thrown, left, discarded like something no longer worth keeping. But whoever had done it hadn't finished the job, and that mistake would soon echo louder than they ever imagined. Word began to trickle through Black Hollow like a poisoned stream. A stranger had been seen riding through the hills. They said he looked like an outlaw, but too calm, too rich. Someone swore they saw him carrying a girl. Another said she was dead. Another said she was his bride. Rumors spread fast in a town where truth was scarce and lies were currency. But the truth was far more dangerous than anything the town could imagine. because Nathaniel Dakota hadn't just stumbled across that ravine. He'd been tracking something. And now he had a witness. By the fourth week, the girl still hadn't said a single word, but her body was beginning to tell the truth. Every scar, every welt, every old wound told a story someone had tried to erase. She moved stiffly, not from fresh pain, but from the memory of restraint. Her arms flinched at the sight of rope, even if it was just a tight curtain. Her eyes darted at the creak of boots in the hallway. Every shadow was still a threat, every sound a warning. She had become a reflection of the place she had been thrown from, ravaged, silent, but not yet defeated. Nathaniel Dakota watched her from a respectful distance. He had long understood that silence was not emptiness, it was language. A woman who doesn't speak still remembers. And memory, once trusted, becomes fire. He brought in a therapist from Santa Fe, not a doctor in a white coat, but a tribal elder named Mina who understood how trauma lived in the body and not always in the mouth. Mina sat with the girl every morning, no clipboard, no questions, just presence. And in time, the girl began to sit near the open window again. She began tracing her fingers across the surface of the table, forming shapes only she understood. A circle, a triangle, an X. It was Nathaniel who finally found the missing piece. One night, while reviewing the ledgers from his old mining firm, he recognized a familiar crude X inside a double ring stamped across multiple transport receipts for cattle and equipment. Except these receipts weren't for cattle. And the dates lined up suspiciously well with reported runaways and missing girls from the border towns. Nathaniel had already begun tracing the trail of Iron House Ranch, a place whispered about but never officially marked. A rogue outfit operating in the cracks of the law, where flesh moved more profitably than livestock. The same axe symbol had appeared on the gate of a burned-out barn found 5 years ago. And now it lived in the trembling hands of the girl he had pulled from death. Her name still hadn't come. So Delora began calling her Raven because of the dark strands of hair that never faded under the sun, and the way she always looked toward the sky before sleeping as if waiting for something to return. Raven didn't resist the name. She accepted it like a thread handed across a canyon. And slowly she began to reclaim herself. She bathed alone. She ate more. Her eyes lost the fog, and her steps grew firmer. But the nightmares never stopped. She would bolt upright in the night, eyes wide, fists clenched, sweat soaking the thin cotton sheet. Delora would rush in, and Nathaniel would remain nearby, silent as always. One night, they found her crouched in the corner, shaking uncontrollably, whispering only one word under her breath, "Barn." That was all Nathaniel needed. He rode. At the next morning, alone. Past the salt flats, into the Badlands, he didn't need a guide. He had maps in his mind that no one else had seen, details passed to him by tribal scouts and railroad inspectors. Whispers from old drifters, too. Scared to say more, Iron House wasn't on any official document, but it lived in the silence of stolen lands. What he found confirmed every suspicion. A compound hidden beneath the rise of two hills, guarded by men in unmarked trucks and protected by miles of razor wire. From a distance, it looked like a cattle operation. But there were no cattle sounds, only silence and shadows moving behind. Tinted windows. Nathaniel didn't engage. Not yet. He returned home with photographs. He returned with names, and he returned with resolve. Back at the estate, Raven had begun drawing again, this time with charcoal on parchment. She drew the same barn every time. Tall slanted roof, double doors chained shut, and a single broken window with rust stains running beneath it like tears. In every sketch, there were girls behind the window, faces blurred, eyes hollow. Nathaniel studied the drawings for hours, not to analyze them, but to understand. This wasn't art. It was a confession from someone who couldn't speak the truth with words. And the most chilling part was that the barn she drew matched one of the buildings he'd seen at Iron House. That night, he placed the drawing beside a map. His finger hovered over the barn, then over the road, then over a nearby creek with only one access route. He wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing for justice, but not the kind that wore a badge. The kind that rode in with no sound. No mercy and no survivors. Nathaniel Dakota knew the law, knew its loopholes, knew the price of silence and the weight of evidence. But he also knew when the law was a weapon used by the wicked. And Black Hollow had long sold its soul to men who buried justice beneath profit. So when he returned from Iron House with photographs and coordinates, he didn't head for the sheriff's office or a courtroom. He went deeper into the shadows where true justice took root. Inside a locked vault beneath Echo Rock, Nathaniel kept the documents no one was supposed to see. Bank records tied to men whose hands were never dirty, only gloved. Names connected to oil companies, transport firms, fake orphanages. And among them, new entries, Iron House Ranch, signed off under aliases but traceable to Black Hollow's most prominent figures. One name stood out more than the rest: Judge Alan Korek, a man known for swift sentencing and clean shoes. Turns out, he'd been signing off on property seizures that coincidentally left girls homeless, unsupervised, and easy to disappear. And then there was Sheriff Nolan Grady, the lawman with a silver mustache and a Bible quote for every sin he committed. His name appeared in more than one column: security fees, delivery clearances, and silent partners in holding companies registered in towns that didn't exist anymore. Nathaniel didn't confront them. He gathered. Over the next week, former accountant turned drifter was brought into the estate. Half blind and shaking, the man had once kept Iron House's books before vanishing after a suspicious barn fire. He thought he was being hunted, and he was right. But Nathaniel didn't want him dead. He wanted his mind. What the man remembered, what he had scribbled into the margins of old notebooks, became the foundation of something more damning than any confession: the ledger of blood. It listed names, not aliases, real ones, dates of disappearance, payments, transfers, the names of girls branded not as humans, but as product. Raven's scars made sense now. Her silence wasn't just trauma, it was survival. She hadn't spoken because her voice had been stolen by men who profited from her pain. Nathaniel sat beside her that evening. No words, just the ledger laid gently on her table. Raven flipped through the pages. Her hand trembled as she reached a line dated 6 months prior. Next to it, the initials RC and the word reject. Nathaniel didn't need to ask. Her entire body recoiled, then stiffened. They tried to break her and failed. So they discarded her. The fury that rose in her wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It pulsed from her chest like a signal finally received. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked Nathaniel in the eyes, not with fear, but with recognition. She saw what he was, not a savior, a weapon. And she was ready to be forged. By then, the town had started to notice things. Judge Korek canceled court unexpectedly and left town under the pretense of a family emergency. The sheriff stopped making his daily rounds. And a low rumble of fear settled over Black Hollow, because when Nathaniel Dakota got quiet, things burned. But the final piece came from an unexpected place. A young stable hand from Iron House slipped a letter into Nathaniel's supply shipment. Inside was a sketch layout of the compound, newer than what Nathaniel had seen, along with a list of guards' times and one note scrawled in red ink. They're expecting a raid. Not an exodus. Nathaniel studied the map under lantern light. He marked each rotation, each storage room, each shadow. He wasn't planning a rescue. He was planning a dismantling. Raven watched him from across the room, standing now with a straight spine, no longer hidden in blankets and silence. She'd begun wearing boots. A wide-brimmed hat hung by the door, and in her eyes was something no one could erase: a promise. The night before the strike, Nathaniel placed a single bundle of rope, a canteen, and an old revolver at her bedside. Not as tools, as reminders that she was no longer prey Iron House had taken from her. Now she would return the favor. They waited for the wine. It came late that evening, dry and whispering through the canyons like an old song that had forgotten its words. The stars above Iron House were dimmed by clouds. and the moon, usually a silent witness, was veiled behind a curtain of gray. Nathaniel Dakota stood at the southern ridge with his coat drawn tight and his eyes locked on the compound below. He didn't need maps anymore. He had memorized every structure, every gap in the fence, every weak spot in the rotation of the guards. But this wasn't about brute force, it was about exposure. Inside the estate, a caravan of silent riders had gathered his men, but not the kind used to war. Former tribal scouts, homesteaders, ranchers who'd lost daughters. Women who had once lived inside the walls of places just like Iron House. They weren't here for vengeance, they were here for the reckoning. Raven sat in the back of one of the covered wagons, wrapped in the same coat Nathaniel had used to save her life. But now, she clutched it like armor. On her wrist was a leather strap bearing a mark of freedom, a hand-stitched feather Delora had given her before the ride out. Her eyes were steady, not wide with fear, but sharp with intent. As the caravan circled wide to the west entrance of Iron House, Nathaniel and 3 others approached the gate on foot. No weapons drawn, just the weight of truth in their hands. The documents, the ledger, a letter signed by state authorities, handed over in secret by an ally who'd spent years building the case. The guard at the gate raised his rifle, confused by the boldness, but Nathaniel didn't flinch. He handed over the papers without a word. The guard looked down, scanned the seal, and went pale. He turned, knocked twice on the steel wall, and vanished behind it. Minutes later, the gates opened. No alarms, no panic. Because those inside weren't expecting justice to walk in. They were expecting it to break the door down. Inside Iron House, everything moved in slow motion. Girls and women barely clothed, sunburned, many silent like Raven had once been peeked out from behind doors, unsure if what they were seeing was real. Some thought it was a trap. Some thought it was another sale, but then they saw her. Raven. She stepped down from the wagon alone, coat billowing behind her, boots hitting the ground like gunshots. A woman named Marla, once a worker in the outer fields, gasped and stumbled back. She recognized Raven not from a name, but from the chain marks around her wrists. Raven nodded once. That's all it took. The line broke. One by one, the women emerged from their cells and barns, some barefoot, some limping, all broken but not gone. Delora and Mina moved quickly to tend to the injured. Canteens were handed out, blankets, shoes, words of comfort. The men who had run Iron House tried to slip away in the confusion, but Nathaniel had posted riders at every route out. There was no escape. Sheriff Grady arrived too late. He came tearing down the trail with 2 deputies and a half-drunken rage in his eyes. He roared at the gate to be closed, threatened everyone within earshot, and leveled his shotgun at one of the guards. But the guard didn't move, because now the law had shifted. The badge on Grady's chest weighed nothing in the presence of truth. Nathaniel stepped forward. No weapon, just a folded sheet of paper. The arrest warrant. Grady spat, swore, refused. Until Raven stepped between them. And for the first time since he'd known her, Nathaniel heard her voice. Low, steady. Do you remember me? Grady blinked, uncertain. Raven pulled down her collar, revealing the faint, carved word beneath it: property. And just beneath it, the initials NG. Grady's hand dropped. The shotgun hit the dirt. He turned to run, but it was too late. Nathaniel's men took him down with ropes and cuffs, dragging him to the wagon reserved for those who'd run out of power. The wind picked up. It howled through Iron House like a spirit loosed from captivity. And above the compound, the women stood tall, no longer prisoners, but witnesses. That night, the fires weren't for destruction. They were for purification. Old barns were burned with purpose, not anger. Shackles tossed into the flames, whips, ledgers, chains, all of it consigned to ash. Iron House was no more. The return to Black Hollow wasn't triumphant. It was surgical. 3 wagons rolled in just before dawn, quiet, steady, escorted by riders who did not speak. The people of the town, those who had spent years turning blind eyes and tightening their shutters, woke to the sound of hoofs and something colder, the weight of consequences. For once, it wasn't lawmen entering. It was the judge. Inside the wagons were not outlaws, but the town's own, Judge Alan Corrick, Sheriff Nolan Grady, and to local ranchers who had fronted as investors in Iron House. Their faces were drawn not with guilt, but with the unraveling of power, because here, in the same place where they once shook hands with preachers and toasted to community, they now faced the truth stripped of every polite lie. Nathaniel Dakota rode at the front, coat sweeping behind him, a black horse beneath him like a storm cloud given legs. He didn't wear a gun, just a satchel full of papers, affidavits, confessions, photographs, and signatures of every official who had tried to bury the truth. There would be no hiding now, no quiet transfer of blame. Black Hollow would face what it had become. At the center of town, a makeshift tribunal was formed, not a courtroom, but a stage outside the abandoned town hall. The townspeople gathered in silence, uncertain what they were about to witness. But when the first testimony was read aloud from a girl named Willa who had escaped Iron House years before and been dismissed as hysterical, the crowd didn't blink. They listened, every word, every name, and then came Raven. She stepped onto the platform with nothing but the old coat around her shoulders and a notebook in her hands. The wind caught her hair, pushed it from her face. She looked at the faces of the people who had lived just miles from her suffering and still did nothing. And she began to read. Her voice did not tremble. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was shaped by fire and silence, by rope scars and nights spent in chains. She named every girl she remembered, every building, every code name. She told of beatings, auctions, cages. And when she was done, she looked straight at the mayor, a man who once told the town that Black Hollow has no trouble with womenfolk, and said only this: you knew. That was all it took. The crowd didn't riot. They didn't scream. They turned. First came the business owners, those who had suspected but never asked questions. Then the teachers, who had seen the missing children in their rosters and were told not to dig. Then the mothers who had lost daughters to the city and were told it was runaway business. That day, the town's silence broke. Within a week, the mayor resigned. Corrick's bank accounts were seized. Grady faced multiple federal charges. More than a dozen men were indicted. And Nathaniel Dakota vanished once more, his mission complete. His name never spoken in court, only etched in whispers. But Raven stayed, not as a victim, as a leader. With the settlement money seized from Iron House, she and Talora opened the Rising Feather home on the edge of town, offering refuge, education, and land to girls who had nowhere left to run. It wasn't charity. It was reconstruction. Redemption layered brick by brick in a place once built on silence. Every girl who came to the home was given a bracelet, a leather band with a single feather etched into it. They weren't told to forget. They were told to remember boldly. Raven visited the ravine once more alone, this time. The rocks where she had once been left to die were now overgrown with wild sage and desert flowers. She knelt where her body had once lain, touched the earth, and whispered a promise that no girl would ever lie here again. Behind her, the town of Black Hollow rang with new bells, not of warning, but of morning and beginning. The frontier hadn't changed, but someone had reminded it what justice looked like. A year had passed, not as the world measured it through dates or headlines, but in the quiet reshaping of broken things. Black Hollow looked the same at first glance. The dust still clung to the windowsills. The steeple still leaned slightly to the left, but beneath the surface, the rot had been cut out. What was left began to grow again. The Rising Feather home had taken root like something ancient reawakened. A low-slung building of adobe and stone, with hand-carved beams and soft desert colors. It stood where a rail depot once trafficked lost souls in silence. Now it welcomed girls from the outskirts, those escaping violence, poverty, and worse. There was no entry requirement, just breath, just survival. Raven, no longer the girl in the ravine, walked the grounds each morning. She didn't bark orders or give sermons. She simply moved, always watching, always noticing. She wore the same boots Nathaniel had given her, now scuffed from work. Her hair was longer, Her eyes deeper, her coat hung on a hook by her door retired. Not forgotten. Each week, new girls arrived, some barely 12. Others in their 20s, hardened by years of hiding. They came with no names, no stories, just the weight of being unchosen. And one by one, they were given space to breathe. No one asked what had been done to them. That story came when they were ready, or never. It didn't matter. Because here, they weren't what had been taken from them. They were what they chose to become. And yet, not everything rested. Nathaniel Dakota had not been seen since the trial ended. Some said he returned to the high mesas to tend to ancestral land. Others whispered he left for Mexico, following another ledger, another trail. A few claimed to have seen him riding alone at dusk near the old riverbed, talking to no one, always moving. Raven never confirmed or denied. She kept a candle in her window, not as a beacon, but as acknowledgement. Justice had come, yes, but peace was earned each day, breath by breath. The ravine remained. Raven had insisted it not be filled in or paved over. She wanted it left exactly as it had been, raw, jagged, and touched. But at its edge now stood a stone marker, hand-chiseled by the girls of rising feather. On it were no names, just one line in rough Apache script, translated below in English. Where the world discarded us, the earth held us. Each year on the anniversary of the rescue, the town gathered at the ravine. Not in mourning, but in reckoning. Men once complicit came to offer labor. Women who'd once kept quiet brought food, books, and song. Children new to the truth, but old enough to feel it, placed wildflowers near the base of the rock. There were no speeches, only silence and the sound of wind where chains had once echoed. Raven stood among them, never above them. She had become a symbol without asking to be one. But she carried it with grace, the way survivors often do, quietly, with fire hidden beneath the skin. One morning, months later, as she walked the northern fence line of rising feather, she saw a figure in the distance, a black horse, a rider draped in shadow. She didn't call out, she didn't run, she simply stopped and waited. Nathaniel didn't approach all the way. He paused on the ridge, looking down at the home they had built together, not with hammers or paint, but with memory, justice, and scars. He raised a hand once, tipped his hat, and turned away. That was the last time anyone saw him, but his presence never left. In the halls of Rising Feather, there hung a charcoal sketch, a girl in chains, reaching up from a ravine toward a silent rider above. No face, just a shadow. Beneath it, one sentence carved into the wood: we weren't saved, we were witnessed. And that was enough. Because in the dust-choked corners of a forgotten frontier, where pain once ruled like a king, redemption had carved its way through stone and silence. And now there were flowers growing where chains once lay.